Hundreds of Americans died in the seconds during which the planes hit the World Trade Center, and thousands more were crushed and torn apart when the towers collapsed. This included hundreds of heroic firemen, the fear showing in their faces, who went in anyway to try to rescue their fellow citizens. We should be outraged by this terrible loss from this terrible crime, and we need to demand justice. If we don't see to it that the guilty parties are punished, we're inviting them to kill us next time. So we have to demand justice. But we have to be careful. You can't just believe everything you hear. In fact, President Bush himself has very rightly warned us.
Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories concerning the attacks of September the 11th. Malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves, away from the guilty.
But to millions of proud Americans, it was the president's conspiracy theory about 19 amateur hijackers with box cutters, supposedly directed by some nut in a cave, somehow overcoming the most sophisticated air defense systems in the world, that seemed like an outrageous conspiracy theory to us. As early as the next day, September 12th, millions, literally millions of Americans thought that the idea that the Pentagon had been hit showed that this was an inside job. We were supposed to believe that a hijacked, slow-moving 757 could penetrate Pentagon airspace, could penetrate missile defenses, could penetrate defenses designed to stop supersonic jet fighters and bombers, and could do it 50 minutes after everyone in the country knew we were under attack. Pretty outrageous. The following day, September 12th, we were asked to believe a more detailed and more ridiculous story, that the plane that flew into Pentagon airspace then made a 240-degree turn around the building, exposing the plane's long and broad side to attack from ground defenses, all without a shot being fired. On September 12th, we were told that if the plane had not made this incredible turn, if it had just headed straight into the Pentagon, it would have crashed into the most high-level, top-secret area of the Pentagon. It would have crashed into the offices of Donald Rumsfeld and all the top brass. But instead of flying straight ahead, it made this ridiculous turn so that it crashed into an area that had been under construction for weeks before, into an area that had been specially reinforced during those weeks to make it more able to withstand just such an attack. And it crashed into an area that, because of the construction, was mostly empty and only contained people who had been judged by the killers as deserving death. Let's say that again. If 9/11 was an inside job, the people who were present at the Pentagon and who had been assigned to work in this very special area had been very specifically selected for death. And then we had to sit and watch as in the next week Richard Myers, the man in charge of North American air defenses that day, the single individual most responsible for the disaster, instead of being court-martialed and shot, was instead promoted to chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Outrageous. Simply outrageous. On the morning of September 11th, many building engineers and demolition experts were disturbed as they watched the collapse of the Twin Towers. No steel frame building in the history of the world had ever collapsed in this manner. A few had been knocked down by earthquakes, but never by fire, or even by planes. In 1945, the Empire State Building was hit by a U.S. Air Force B-25 bomber, killing 14 people, but causing no significant damage to the building's steel frame. The designers of the World Trade Center anticipated such hazards.
The building was designed to have a fully loaded 707 crash into it. That was the largest plane at the time. I believe that the building probably could sustain multiple impacts of jetliners because this structure is like the mosquito netting on your screen door, this intense grid, and the jet plane is just a pencil puncturing that screen netting. It really does nothing to the screen netting.
A 707, by the way, is heavier than the planes that hit the World Trade Center. And 20 minutes after the second plane crash, when nearly all the jet fuel had been burned up, the buildings just seemed to explode, throwing steel girders weighing hundreds of tons for hundreds of feet, burying them into buildings on the other side of the street. Virtually all of the fuel from the planes had been consumed in the first 20 minutes. Where did all this explosive force come from? But most of all, the engineers were disturbed by the apparent collapse of the enormously strong central core of the towers. An indestructible rectangle of 47 box beam columns made with 4-inch thick steel at the base, tied together with a tight net of more steel girders and trusses, making up the backbone of the World Trade Center. Even if the floors had pancaked around it, after the floors collapsed, we should have seen the central core standing tall, rising out of the smoke. And we do see parts of the core, for a moment, standing in the smoke, before they simply evaporate inexplicably. Buildings have pancaked in the past, but they looked like this, not like this. Why do we see no floors pancaked on top of each other? And so people began to look more closely at the video of the collapse, and they began to see more evidence that something else was going on, that the buildings had been taken down not by exploding planes, but by explosive charges planted in the building. In a professional demolition, you see what are called squibs, where the explosives occasionally vent their explosive force out the side of the building. And sure enough, when you look, you can see squibs going off all over. The specialized explosive used by professionals to demolish a steel frame is called thermate. It is placed in key locations and melts large steel joints in an instant, which is precisely what we see here. Look closely at this photograph. This is one of the box girders of the central core. Look at it. It's been clearly melted. Although jet fuel does not create anything near the heat necessary to melt steel, the physicists and engineers began to find evidence of large amounts of molten steel pouring out of the side of the building, pouring down into the basement, creating incredible temperatures, 1100 degrees at the top of the rubble pile 6 weeks later.
Out still on the rubble, it's still, I believe, 1100 degrees. The guy's boots just melt within a few hours.
And turning up months later as huge chunks of iron and concrete slag. And slowly, other information began to come out, information that proved dramatically and indisputably the true nature of the conspiracy behind this horrible crime. We learned that at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, Building 7, a 42-story glass and steel structure located across the street from the World Trade Center, collapsed. It was not hit by any planes at all. It appeared to have suffered only minor damage, but nevertheless it simply fell down in what is clearly and classically a controlled demolition. But you ain't heard nothing yet. Larry Silverstein, the leaseholder of the World Trade Center, accidentally told PBS that he had the building demolished.
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, you know, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
Outrageous. Simply outrageous. It takes months of preparation and planning to do a controlled demolition like this one. They had to have put these charges in place before September 11th. Larry Silverstein was kind enough to tell us that they demolished this building on September 11th.
And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building.
But who was they? And are we supposed to think that they didn't have explosive charges in place in the Twin Towers? Of course they did. Now, this video is called Justice for 9/11 because we want to see the guilty parties arrested.